So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out. It's Hispanic Heritage Month, and we have Professor Jorge Majfud of Spanish and International Studies, who's going to give a presentation on the long and tragic U.S.-Latin American relationship and the invention of the Hispanics. You may think invention of the Hispanics sounds like an odd thing, but if you think about it for a minute, right? We have all these words like Hispanic or Asian or African. We just lump all these people together.
Even human.
Yeah.
For sure.
And he has a new book out about that thick in Spanish. Los Salvajes Fronteras.
The Wild Frontier, you know.
Yeah. That talks about these issues. So if you could read Spanish, that would keep you busy for some time. So without further ado, here's Professor Majfud.
Anyway, there are many articles and part of that translated to the unpublished in English and another language, but not to the full book of it is 700 pages. So, okay, let's start. The first time I visited the United States in 1995, I had to fill out a form before arrival. In the race section, I wrote no race. It was the first time in my life that I had read such a classification. A decade later, after traveling and living in some 50 countries, I returned to set up in a classroom here, actually in UCA. Over time, I understood that you had to play the game. The more Hispanic, mark Hispanic instead of white, the more political power the government affords them. The logic is well traveled. Minority groups accept being confined to a box with a label conferred by the dominant group. Through sharing a language, a history, and an otherness, and whether I wanted to or not, at 40 years of age, I began converting myself into a Hispanic, among other things. Like any social group, we are an invention, a political and symbolic construction. In fact, the terms Hispanic and Latino are inventions of the United States government, or precisely they used to tag a specific group. And from a bureaucratic and then cultural point of view, it was invented by the US government. It was in the 70s. In fact, this is nothing new, especially considering the country's obsession with race since before it was founded. As an invention, as an invention, we Hispanics are a reality, and as a reality, many wish to escape from the box, not in rebellion, but rather in submission. A Z that needs to be accepted by the A group must be at least 200% A to be accepted as an almost A. In a civilized society, change is allowed. But no one needs to forget who they were, or who they are, or who they want to be integrated or accepted, leaving aside the neo-slavery and neo-imperialistic doctrine of assimilation. Furthermore, the idea of being accepted is another invented need. Why the hell do I care if others do not accept me as I am? When someone in a supermarket sees red because another speaks to their child or the cashier in Spanish, because the green their own in Spanish, because another speaks the green their own laws about. Let me repeat something again. When someone in a supermarket sees red because of another or other speaks to their language or speak the child or the cashier in Spanish, they create their own laws about the language, the language that must be spoken in this country. This person is breaking the same laws they claim to defend. Everything that is not prescribed by the law is permissible. As history shows, no progression towards equal rights originated from the groups in power. I don't know any example, except at the end when the society achieves certain consensus, politicians begin to champion about the new values in society. As we can name many examples about that. Instead, they came from organized resistance of those below. In this sense, we Hispanics in the United States have a historical debt. Yes, we had a Cesar Chavez, but we have been far too accommodating in the face of an obscene list of injustices. We have not had a Malcolm X who dared to speak directly to power radically rather than delicately. Even worse, countless times we have betrayed the heroic struggles of other minorities. Firstly, because privileged immigrants have been unable to resist the temptation to pass off as white. Secondly, because we, Latin Americans, have also been corrupted by centuries of interventions and dictatorship promoted by Washington. Of course, in that case, around 2 centuries. And the corporation, that was crucial. We need to understand this. If we don't understand this, we don't understand our present and nothing in history. Corporation that installed and removed puppets as presidents or dictators, who demand laws and privileges for their businesses and who destroy democracies, many, leaving behind millions of exiles and massacred bodies. And then we have a wave of immigrants. We can talk about that. It's a long story. People only focus on the object and never widen the scope to understand the whole context of everything. Initially, this was justified by the traditional racial excuse that we were corrupt mestizos. That is a very common narrative in the 30s, 40s, and the 19th century. You can find in thousands of newspapers, and this is very repetitive, and it's a pattern. We were corrupt because we didn't consider black people inferior people. So that's Mexican are absolutely barbarian. Not to consider that the slavery was part of the civilization and freedom and their freedom, not everybody's freedoms. We were corrupt mestizos because we did not consider black people as an inferior race. Of course, they use the N word all the time. Or that we did not know how to govern ourselves. Classic excuse at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, to establish protectorates and bloody dictatorship. Not because of communism, because communism didn't exist at that moment. It was because they were black and unable to govern themselves, and they were bloody dictatorship, all to protect big business interests like United Fruit Companies, Standard Oil Companies, then later ITT, Pepsi Cola, so on and so forth. Dictatorship just to protect all those big interests. That is a pattern. It's a pattern, always a pattern. Except when they won the elections, everything was okay. When they lost the election, they never recognized the election and immediately engineer bloody military coup. We can talk a lot about that because everything is well documented and there is no discussion about this, just that people ignore it. That is the strategy. We did it, but now ignore it. We are going to recognize that we did it, but who cares? The truth is no longer relevant. So we declassify the document when the truth is not dangerous. After the Second World War, the marvelous excuse of I think skip something, but it doesn't matter. The marvelous excuse of the fight against communism emerged to continue doing the same thing that had been done since the beginning of the 19th century. The U.S. pro-slavery contingent expanded slavery across Native American territories and restored it throughout Mexican lands, all justified by the repeated discourse of promoting freedom and democracy. This practice never changed, although it did become more sophisticated. With the multi-million-dollar secretive intervention of the CIA and the rich Creole elite in our continent, that is the rich Latin American ruling class, who immediately allied. That is a pattern since biblical time. You know, the invader immediately allied with the ruling class to oppress the people. If you are a religious people or Christian, you remember a classic political execution, which was the crucifixion, Why? Jesus was crucified along with the 2 other criminals. Why that? Not because of religion, it was because it challenged the power of the Roman Empire, and he was crucified by an empire, as many others after him, because of different reasons, not religious reasons sometimes. We have also betrayed, we Hispanics, our brothers and sisters in the South by denying the racist and classist reality behind the imperial arrogance of Washington. And this is very important to distinguish. Every time we say we are playing the game of language trap. We didn't do that. Don't feel obligated to defend something, a crime, for example. That's why I prefer to talk about Washington, even if it's not the city. It's normally the government alive and as a protector of big interests, big companies, and not the US, because the US is a very complex, very diverse reality. People think different, they have different opinions, they are not responsible for what many dictatorships have been placed around the world, but particularly in Latin America, because they didn't know, they know nothing. That is the idea of that was established as a propaganda machinery to distract with the narrative about a good cause, freedom, democracy, fight communists, etc. Just to keep doing exactly the same atrocities around the world and Latin America to protect those special interests. And of course, the ruling class profited a lot. They waved, for example, in the last decades, even today, they waved the communist threat as a flag every time they need money from Washington. It was very profitable from the ruling class. And they, after a while, they believe that that is the real reason. That's how language works in culture, actually. As a hegemonic power with the ability to print trillions of the global currency, and with hundreds of military bases all around the world. After the 1776 revolution and during the 80s, and particularly at the beginning of the 20th century, there were multiple forts. You know, you have Fort Sumter everywhere in the US. Those were basic military bases, and they were as farther than our current military bases in the other extreme of the world. Those were military bases. Well, today was the same practice to provoke some of the Indians, as for example Andrew Jackson did, and blame the Indians, and then John Wayne blamed the Indians because they attacked us without any reason. So that is it. We were attacked first, multiple times. That's a pattern. The global currency and with hundreds of military bases all around the world. The United States can conduct very profitable business negotiations by twisting the arm of those non-compliant nations. That's very easy to do very good business when you have that force behind you. No one calls extremely impoverished countries such as Haiti and Honduras, just to name 2, capitalist, even though they are more capitalist than the US. Thus, the greatest expulsion of immigrants, usually black or mestizo and poor, come from these capitalist countries that are not on Washington's boycott list. On the contrary, they are financed with millions of dollars, as well as the classical moral and media narrative. Now, the immigrants who depend on their work to survive, and very frequently escaping from those bloody dictatorships, right-wing bloody dictatorships to protect foreign investors and investment and business, those poor people must adhere to the law of supply and demand in an even more dramatic fashion than capital. But capital is free. The workers are not. They are not even free to say what they think. The very same immigration laws, everyone who has been in a US embassy for a visa will be aware of this, detest workers, hate workers. Never say that you love to work in a US embassy, never. you have to say you are a very lazy person, but have money in your bank. That is the best. It sounds funny, but that's the truth. Never say you love to work and I have been always an honest person. And so when a Hispanic arrives in a country with this hegemonic force, often fleeing from the violence, corruption, and chaos organized by the same country, they dress up as an Hispanic. Many claim to be fleeing from countries where they do not have freedom of expression. By the second they hear a different opinion, they vomit the old myth from the A group. If you do not agree, go to another country. That's very similar to the very fascist motto from the Brazilian dictatorship, by the way, installed by and supported by Washington in 1964. And the motto was Brasil, ame ou deixe o, in Portuguese, love it or leave it. And then you may have read in the US the saying, love it or leave it. What does it mean? If you don't agree with how in power, you are against us. You are anti-us. You are a dangerous person. So you don't love our country because you disagree. So that is the idea, very fascist idea that's repeated in Italy, in Mussolini, Hitler, obviously. And you were not a Nazi, but you were anti-German. During the reconquest in Spain, you were not anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim. You were a suspicious person, so you were against us, and you were not a bold Christian. That is a pure blood Christian. That was not by coincidence since 1492 on. It is as if the adulation of power and the reification of national myth were a moral and constitutional obligation, as if countries had honors, as if they were cults, armies, football teams, political parties, as if critical thinking and the search for truth were somehow anti-American. In 2019, a terrorist killed 23 Hispanic people in a Walmart in Texas. Everybody remember, that's going to be forgotten, obviously, as many other terrible domestic terrorist attacks that are many, as paramilitarism is very popular here. It's not just in Colombia. The Colombian paramilitarism responsible for 90% of the death throughout 40 years in Colombia were an invention of Washington. They explicitly said that's their way to not just to organize and control dissidents, but also to prevent someone blaming us. So channel money to those paramilitary, and the same happened in Brazil, the death squads, etc. All those were not by coincidence in the same ideological group that supported big companies, big money, big capitals, and were against common people, middle class, workers, etc. Actually, the word worker became a taboo. Here we have a Labor Day. We don't have Workers' Day. The rest of the world celebrates May the 1st to remember the tragedy in Chicago, a very strong workers' organization in Chicago, and a way to forget that too dangerous. Poor people are always dangerous, mostly when they are organized. Remember, the racism was inoculated also before the foundation of this country in order to divide poor white people, who were, some of them were indentured slaves, also black people who were always slaves, and Indians. So the way to corrupt them and divide was to inoculate racism, and that was explicitly written in, for example, in Governor Chamberlain, North Carolina. It was in 1858. So it's a very common strategy. In 2019, a terrorist killed 23 Hispanic people in Walmart in Texas, alleging that the Hispanic were invading his country. And also remember, those like Minutemen and many other groups that WAR, that's WAR, White Aryan Resistance, and many others, were founded and are integrated by people who were acting in many other countries And for example, in the Nicaragua, they trained the Contras. The CIA trained them, but there were many of those elements who trained them. So it's okay. The borders to defend are our borders, but other people's border doesn't matter. It's our frontier. So we have the right to explore, as it was said in the 19th century. But their borders doesn't exist. The only border that we have to defend, because this is a country of law. Another myth, because every single treaties with the Indians, with Mexicans, with any other people were broken by Washington. So it's not a country of law. And actually their own law that Washington passed was broken multiple times when it was needed. So powers was actually the key factor here. This was a mirror of the linguistic inversion of Andrew Jackson, who, after pillaging and massacring Native American communities, accused them of unprovoked aggression. And James, remember, it was an address of the Union, but it was in December 1833. And James Polk said this: we have to take the land and give them to the real lover of freedom, who are farmers, independent farmers. Obviously, black people were not independent farmers. He was talking about white farmers, and that was the radicalization of the Southern politics, particularly since 1828. That's Andrew Jackson on. That was, and even when they were defeated in the war, in the Civil War, they never accepted that defeat and continue inoculating their ideology, not just placing monuments very quickly, etc., lying about the lost cause that it was just to install slavery, reinstall slavery in Texas, reinstall and gain more pro-slavery states in California. They failed in California in the sense, but they took California anyway, New Mexico, Arizona, etc., just to break the balance in Washington, because northern politicians were anti-slave, and southern who were completely overrepresented. Remember that the electoral system that we use today is an inheritance from that time. It's slavery time. Why? Because the southern, in some cases like in South Carolina, more than 50% of people were black. They didn't vote. So they have to invent a system that is electoral college in order to balance more or less the south and the north. But the voters were in the north, and the political power overrepresented was in the south. And they became the master, annexing more and more territories that were slave-free in Mexico. Texas was free of Mexican legalized slavery in Texas. But they gave away land to the northern Anglo farmers, and they say, you are welcome here, but remember that slavery is illegal here. So you have to free your slaves. They are welcome, but you have to free them. And Stephen Austin lobbied Mexico since 1822 to 1836. And all those were Mexican, became Mexican citizens. But during the 30s, Mexicans realized that was very dangerous, because the new immigrants never observed any law. Not even the most important law for that was the center of the conflict, that was not to have a slave in Mexican territory. And Austin and Houston lobbied in the Mexican capital, in the Mexican Congress, to make Texas an exception. It was not all Texas as we know it today. They owned just a stripe in the Gulf. They were very fertile land, and they made a lot of money with cotton. But they need other people to work for them and to make them, that is, black people, slave people. And that was the reason why Texas became independent. And then you have in the high schools, we need to establish more freedoms in Texas. That is why we made Texas independent. Come on, your freedom, because you reinstalled and put in the Constitution. Now slavery cannot be even questioned. So the reason is too obvious. Every letter that you can read at that moment, even Austin said, the only Mexicans are great, I would never betray them, but the only problem is that they insist that the slavery had to be illegal. They don't accept slavery. And if not for that, we would be all happy. But it's just a little. And then you have, for example, the Alamo, a very mythical movie by white supremacist John Wayne, produced and acted by white supremacy. Well, he was in People's Magazine, 1972. He said, "Well, I don't agree with." I remember the Marlon Brando when he didn't accept the Oscar and sent a representative of the Indians. But besides that, he said, "I don't agree saying that we have to apologize for anything. We did the right thing. Indians had too much land and they didn't want to share with us their land, so we have to protect it. And if you take a car and drive from Georgia to Georgia to North Carolina, any state, you can drive and drive and drive, even with modern technology, the best highways, hours and hours, and you are not going to see anything. So that was too little land for them. So they need more. Remember, they need many weeks to go from one state to the other state. So it was not that they need land, even if they didn't need land, that was not the other people's problem. It was an obsession, probably a cultural, psychological problem, to take and feel that they have everything under control, particularly the imperial races. And that has been repeated in the Congress many times. But I can interrupt my reading for a while, but I would like to I think I have a few quotes here. Let me see. For example, well, General Wilfer Scott, obviously, he hated Paul because he was trying to invent an excuse to provoke the Mexicans. And and then to say we were attacked first, and then we have to go to the war, and that's what he did. And actually, the limits of when Mexico recognized that they lost Texas, they have the limit that there was the Sabine River. In every document was the Sabine River. Everything was very clear. And Paul sent an emissary, said, "Go and look for another river with the same name. If you don't find it, name it with the Sabine River." So if the reality doesn't adapt to our words, sorry for the reality. So and General Winfield Scott, the hero of the Mexican-American Revolution, and General Zachary the President Zachary Taylor, who was a president in the 50s, and even Ulysses Grant, who wrote a letter to Julia. And all those documents are very consistent. And for example, many cables at that time was not cable that from General Winfield Scott. Our militia and volunteer, if a tenth of what is said be true, have committed atrocity horrors in Mexico, sufficient to make heaven weep and every American of Christian morals blush for the country. Murder, robbery, or rape on mothers and daughters in the presence of the tied-up males of the families have been common all along the Rio Grande. As far as I can learn, not one of the fellows have been punished, and very few rebukes. The officials generally being as much afraid of their men as the poor, suffering Mexicans themselves are afraid of the mistreats. So the US was not sending the best people, obviously. There are many others, for example. So the Senator Lewis Casa, for example, this is a long quotation, but I fully agree here in all that it would be the probable amalgamation with Mexican. No such evil will happen to us in our day. We do not want the people of Mexico either a citizen or subject. All we want is a portion of the territory. We'll use, that was in the Congress, we'll use, say Senator, incorporate it in your union, and Cotton said, certainly not. We shall hold it as a means of procuring an honorable peace, and such a peace it may be made to procure for us. The same senator, but a few years later, we have never dreamed to incorporating into the union any but the Caucasian race for the free white race. That's the Caucasian race, the free white race.
To incorporate Mexico will be the very first instance of the kind of incorporating an Indian race. For more than half of Mexicans are Indians, and of the other is composed chiefly of mixed tribe, etc., etc. And O'Sullivan, the great author of the Manifest Destiny, this continent is for the white people, and not only the continent, but the island adjacent and the people must be kept in slavery at Cuba and Haiti under white Republican masters. As for the free black, there is another continent for them. The Monroe Doctrine is not sufficient. Of course, they sent them to Haiti and to Africa. They founded Liberia city because of them. I actually have a student from Liberia, etc. 1858, it was Albert Brown was governor of Massachusetts and senator at this moment, and said, I want Cuba. I know that sooner or later we must have it. If the worm-eaten throne of Spain is willing to give it for a fair equivalent, money was a way to legitimize every time. We can see that, but we are not going to have time, I think. Well, if not, we must take it. I want Tamaulipas, Potosí, and one or two other Mexican states. And I want them all for the same reason. For the planting and spreading of slavery. And a footing on Central America will powerfully aid us in acquiring other states. It will render that less valuable to the other powers of the earth, and thereby diminish the competition with that. Yes, I want these countries for the spread of slavery. I will spread the blessing of slavery, like the religion of our divine master, to the uttermost ends of the earth. And rebellious and wicked and the Yankees have been, I will even extend it to them. I will not force it, this is 1858. I will not force it up to them. So nice. As I will not force religion up to them, but I will preach it to them, as I will preach the gospel. They are, etc., etc. And say that, of course, the land of the Latin American rebellion, etc. They, of course, imposed that, and even recently, using very violent means. If that democracy worked, okay. If they vote, as Nixon said when Dr. Allende won the election in 1970, Nixon said, I'm not going to tolerate that the people vote the wrong guy in the irresponsible way. Of course, in 1958, Allende lost the election to Alexander, a conservative president, and then lost the election again in 1964 with a lot of praise. But in both elections, the CIA put million dollars in the campaign. And in the 1970s, money was not enough, and so Henry Kissinger and Helms and many others said, well, let's prepare another coup. And before Allende took office, the documents are there, September 1970 through September 11, the tragic day for Chile, September 11, 1973. It was a bloody dictatorship, a Nazi-like dictatorship with thousands of people massacred, torture, etc. And we can talk a lot about the successful neoliberal agenda that was imposed on Chile before being imposed to the US here. I need 10 hours to complete this, but I'm going to move faster. Okay. Let's go and skip a paragraph. The profound racism of politicians and KKK sympathizers sympathizing ultra-religious zealots from whom Hitler took inspiration, according to his own work. Also, remember, Nazism was an inspiration of many intellectuals, pro-racist and intellectual in the tradition of the US. Hitler recognized, for example, the book The Passing of the Great Race, published in 1916, and Hitler was in the jail, was a soldier at that moment, wrote that book, read that book, wrote Mein Kampf, and took many sentences and ideas from that book, and actually sent a letter to Madison Grant in New York saying, thank you for that book, that's my Bible. say that. And but that was, if you want to trace the Nazism tradition in the KKK and many other very American groups, that is very easy. And not by chance, the big billionaires in the US were all most of them were pro-Nazi, and they were integrated by Hitler, Henry Ford, the GM CEO, Texas CEO, Alcoa, that helped a lot of Hitler, and Walt Hearst, the one with Joseph Pulitzer, who invented the Spanish-American War from out of the blue. They invented the son of the USS Maine in hours when the crew in Havana said, "We have an accident, a terrible accident here. More than 200 Americans died," and it was an accident. The crew said that it was an accident. But in the Imperial, they wanted to sell papers. They sold 1 million copies per day. They did a great business. They say not even a crazy guy would believe that Spain attacked us. But they invented that attack, and so we were attacked first. Never forget the name. And that is what people today remember. Ask to a high schooler why the Spanish-American War. Because the Spanish sunk the USS Maine. Because we were attacked first, we had to defend ourselves. So that was to stall, to kidnap a revolution almost ended by the Cuban people. And but what was the problem? Remember that the southern politicians expanded by land Indian territories, like Mexican territories, etc., then Philippines, etc., by the sea. But they stopped in the borders we have today. And the discussion was, why not to take Cuba? Why not to take the rest of Mexico? If we were in the capital, they were completely defeated because of the earthquake, but also because of a terrible war. They didn't want to, as usually Iran say, poor Mexican, they don't want to even fight this war. And why we didn't take everything? But we can do that now. And the same racists who made that a reality were the same that established a limit, a border. Why? And if you read the newspaper at that moment, you will understand why. They didn't want another black state. They called any states. Cuba was considered a whiter country until they invaded Cuba and said, "Oh, but most of the people here are black people. We already have too many problems with remember the Jim Crow era after Lincoln." And so we don't want hybrid people, Mexican. We don't want more. So this is the government of the white race. So, and actually, just keep in mind why. Just mention this here very quickly. New Mexico and Arizona was taken in 1848. Didn't become a full state until 1912. Can you guess why? The Hispanic were a majority, and they sent many multiple commissions to check until when they became a minority, a responsible race took place, but became a majority. They became a full states of the US, and the same the story is very. So the US is not largely because the Caribbean was so full of black people. Mark Twain was against all that. Thoreau was against all that. They call that actually Mark Twain founded the anti-imperialist. Was one of the founder of anti-imperialist league. Today will be considered comics, but that's because of the obsession of the Cold War. But the narrative before say just they are black people. In Filipinas, they invented an attack just to betray Aguinaldo, the leader of Filipinos who were pro-American, to take the whole Filipinas and to control them. And the business, etc., but also to control, because they said we need points like Guantanamo or Puerto Rico, which is still a colony. They cannot vote for president because they have no representation with vote here in the US, and many other places in the Pacific Ocean. And they have a sword to kill black people, and they say, many letters, if you read the letters, it's so emotional when I take the gun and shoot down people. It's very passionate. It was a sport. It was called actually have a name. And many people like Mike Twain and many others said it's very rare because in war normally wounded people are outnumbered the dead. And here there are no wounded, they are all dead. Well, the order was to execute every wounded, and in order to not to spend too much money taking care of them. Okay, let's, if I can, okay, we finished. Okay, so the profound racism of politicians and KKK sympathizers, ultra religious zealots from whom Hitler took the inspiration, according to his own words, was reborn as an ideological triumph after the Confederacy was defeated in battle. Not without irony, modern-day Mexico and all Caribbean, that's what I mentioned, and Central American countries are not state of the US because the invaders discovered that those countries were full of black people. When Abraham Lincoln ended the long US dictatorship, and some people say, how do you say that the US was never a dictatorship? It's a complete matter of interpretation. If you point out a country and say in that country only between 10 and 20% in the best moment can vote, but they have to be honored, they have to be male, they have to be white, and you have 1 million of people enslaved, sometimes in some states a majority, and you call that a democracy. Well, name it whatever name you want it, but it's highly questionable. For me, that's a perfect dictatorship, ethnicity dictatorship. Former slave owners brought in the Jim Crow laws as a result Cubans in Florida, which in the class in industries and hospitals, I'm talking about the late 19th century, which in class industries and hospitals did not discriminate between black and white people, were separated by force and obliged to adopt the custom of the successful Anglo-Saxons. New Mexico and Arizona, well, I already mentioned that, did not become states with the full right to vote until 1912, when Washington was able to verify that the Hispanic majority had received since 1848 to the point of becoming minority. From 1836, Hispanics that stayed north of the border became the invading outlaws. And remember, the Zorro was a complete distortion of that. There were many Zorros at that moment, but the enemy were those rangers who stole, those newcomers who stole the Mexican rangers. They became, according to the Guadalupe Hidalgo treaties, Americans, but they were never treated as an American because they were not white. And actually, that whiteness was in the law since the foundation. Romanized by Hollywood with the character of the Zorro. Those that arrived had to fight in the courts until the beginning of the 20th century to prove they were white. That was a common practice. During the Great Depression in the 30s, 500,000 Americans were deported to Mexico because they had Mexican faces, an accent, causing many to continue fighting to whiten themselves. And that practice continues even today, but not because of the law. The law, unfortunately, have changed for the good. This psychology of the colonized, of the individual desperate to accept through disguising themselves, continue to this day. So consequently, the greatest service that anyone can do for this country is not to go to the beach with the stars and stripes emblazoned across their bathing suit, but rather to tell the truth. Above all, inconvenient truths, those that have been buried by the brute force of barbarism in the name of civilization, and also in the name of dictatorship, in the name of freedom, in the name of democracy. That's very common in Latin America. Until then, we will continue to be complicit in imperial myth, just as we maintain those those useless patches of grass at the front of our houses to avoid rising tables, perfectly geometric and with no sign of human life around them, the neurotic expression of Anglo-Saxon control, even of nature. Someone said in the beginning of the 19th century that he was referring mostly to Protestant. It was an American writer. The Protestantism, I don't agree with that generalization, but it's kind of a joke at that moment. Protestantism was the fear that someone somewhere can be happy. We do the same with the myths. The country will never overcome the trauma of the Civil War, nor will achieve great social progress until it stops lying to itself. We Hispanic can contribute to a courageous change or we can join the ranks of cowardly self-satisfaction and the misty-eyed adulation of power. And I finish here so we can take your question. Go on. A little longer than expected. Yes, I hear you.
Jorge, I'm shocked to discover that our country has ever invaded another country on false pretenses. Shocked. But on a more serious note, what you say is very interesting, and I was looking at the body language of those of us in the audience who were raised in Texas and raised on all this ideological propaganda. We all had our arms crossed because we were raised with what Nietzsche calls monumental history, a celebration of the great achievements of America, and particularly Texans. And Scott and I are from Texas, so is my wife. And we're taught to believe this is wonderful, this is great, this is fantastic, this is who we are, and it's all great. And Nietzsche distinguishes between that and what he calls antiquarian history and also critical history. And it strikes me that the current controversy, for example, around, or supposed controversy around critical race theory being taught in schools, which it really isn't, but people are claiming it is, it's really a kind of combat between monumental history on the one hand and critical history on the other. And I think what you contribute here is really important, and I really was pleased to hear what you had to say. And it's hard for those of us who were raised with that kind of indoctrination of that propaganda. But what you say is important.
Yeah, I would say that that's happening in almost any country. I had a similar problems in my first country, and it was called anti-patriotic because of raising certain issue about the Indians. But of course, this country has been much powerful, and it was an Elysian empire. So everything that this country does has a 10,000 times more effect on other people. So normally, and if you add that the obsession of race, that has a continuity since the foundation, before the foundation to even today. Yes, race theory was called by a former president child abuse, and we had to teach patriotic history in university. Have no idea what a university is. That is very serious, an attack on academic freedom. Absolutely. And also, I don't care if a student record my classes, but I would like the Florida law to be observed that says that you have to have a permission to do that. But certain politicians are, like in Brazil, President Bolsonaro did the same, to stimulate or ask the student to record the professor because of to detect certain ideology. Their ideology would be not ours. So naming one person without an ideology, we're going to try that as a rare case. But that's very common in many countries, and particularly other countries normally copy what we do here in the US. So that's why it's even more dangerous and serious when it's happening here.
Yeah, I'm wondering what you think the role of race is in U.S. Sort of policy and stuff. Because like you talk about, back in the day there were explicitly racist justifications for invading countries where the lesser people need help and stuff like that. I think it may have been partly because of the Cold War that a lot of the rhetoric switched from that kind of rhetoric to anti-communist rhetoric, and now our official rhetoric is all very much anti-racist.
Yes.
Right. Now the policies aren't always. Puerto Rico's not a state.
It's a colony.
Yes. I wonder why.
Washington has the last word. It doesn't matter referendums they have.
So I mean, what do you see the role of race, like the category of the Hispanics? What do you see that playing out in the ideology?
Race and racism has always been a tool to domination of the ruling classes, in that case the white class, and to divide and actually the word was my job has been to inoculate hate between Indians and black people, because black people used to cross the Appalachian to look for refuge in Indian territories. So the white master went there to corrupt Indians. The same happened black people ran away as slaves across the Mexican border to look for the freedom that they were accepted here. Fort Mose here, very close to the St. Augustine, was a black free community for centuries ago and for many, many generations. So there was a clear obsession in the Anglo-Saxon side of keep everything under control, because if not, someone is going to attack you. And for example, right now in Australia, that's the same connection in the 19th century. Remember the killing in Australia because of the danger of the white genocide? So many people were worried about white genocide even today in the US. White genocide, that was invented in the 19th century. And why that? I suspect that because Europe at that moment owned the world. They went all over around the world. They killed just in what is Congo, 10 million people. The Belgium, Leonard, there are 10 million people just in a few years for business, and that's continuing during the Cold War. They killed Lumumba because he came here to ask for American help for his revolution. They say no to go back, and because Wall Street had a big business with Belgium, obviously, and Lumumba had to ask for a few old airplanes to the Soviet Union. So that was the perfect excuse to say, look, it's the communists, they killed them, they installed another terrible dictator, Mobutu, and the big companies celebrate all of that. But the white, so in the 19th century, they dominated most of the world, mostly England, Netherlands, Belgium, and in many ways the US as well. It was a growing superpower. But they discovered that they were a minority, and they got in panic. And in many articles they wrote and published at that moment, they said that like exactly the same like during the slavery in the US, they need to keep in control. So that's why weapons are very, very important, to keep in control all that mass of slaves, because they may unite and rebel against us. And the same thing happened with the colonies around the world. So there were many books published. Roosevelt, actually, Theodore Roosevelt, completely different to Delano Roosevelt, who was called Stalin Delano Roosevelt by the press at that in the 30s. But before that, in the 90s and on, Theodore Roosevelt said that the democracy, the only reason for democracy is to ensure the best land of the continent to the white race, because the end people are the perfect idiot race. And that was common at that moment. Then the language became a little bit more politically correct, a little bit, but the practice was more or less the same. But of course, that's not an absolute power. There are many people who resist that, who fought many battles, who suffer, like the civil movement in the US here and many other movements. So fortunately, we made some progress. But time to time, all that long tradition come back and repeat exactly the same words and the same ideas. Very simple, very simplistic. Don't expect them to be very sophisticated. Very simplistic, it's easy to sell. That's consumerist culture. You have to be easy to sell it. If nobody is too complicated, you are not going to sell it. Well, that's exactly the same with the political ideas. Very simplistic, and that's a source of simplification in the 19th century, for example. And all that spread out in the 20th century Latin America. All that racism and brutal killings, tortures. In the first part of the 19th century, the US did it directly. But Roosevelt had to withdraw many troops and marines from many protectorates because of the Great Depression, but also because he tried to reset the relationship with the good neighborhood policy. But right after Roosevelt, everything changed again. American countries recovered many democracies because they were left alone. And it's not rare that the Southern Cone are the most developed and freest countries and more balanced countries in Latin America, because they had no resources and mineral resources, and they were very far from big superpower. And so during the 30s and particularly during the 40s, Latin America recovered dozens of democracies. But right after Stalin stopped being the major ally of the US, became the only enemy. Immediately, Washington, Kennedy actually said we have to put more money on the militaries, Latin American militaries. They are useless, but they are the most important institution to control those countries. They invited thousands of them to the School of the America, the School of Dictators, that produced many dictators, and they actually taught torture, etc. Nixon said the same. I will never cut budget to the military in Latin America because they are under our control. It's declassified, all that documentation. So the need to control in those cases just for money, for big business, was relevant, but also the addition of an obsession of race, that someone is going to attack us, someone is want to exterminate us, so we are going to do it first. It's a preventive action. That has been an obsession since the 19th century. And it's still here. Yeah.
I don't know if you touch on this, but of course you perhaps know that eugenicists in the U.S. Congress debated gassing immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe in the early 1920s. Another very hard truth. I mean, these are all hard truths. Yeah.
And in 1820, it was the Asian Exclusion Act. So no Chinese were able to come. But all that ended basically in 1965, right? I'm sorry.
Well, no, just I was referring to the 20s, the 1920s.
Yes. Yeah, it was to filter Jewish people and Italian. They established quota, but the quota, that is the percentages of, for example, Irish people were X percentage of the whole, so they will establish a quota of immigrants that we allow. But that was, the picture was not the sense of 1920, it was the sense of 1980. Because at that moment, Jewish and Italian immigration were a minority. So the major immigrant group were Germans and Irish. And actually Irish were not white at the moment. They were persecuted as nasty people because of the color of their hair, the orange hair. They were Catholics, and so they were persecuted, they were treated as dogs. But they became white in the 20th century and placed a president in the presidency in 1961. 2061.
All right, let's give Professor Mahfoud a hand.
Okay.
And speaking of critical